But really, the biggest issue here is that you're not measuring whether or not the game's good.
Distraction makers.
I read about Goodhart's law, which is it's weird to call it a law. Feels like more of a theory.
I think it's a theory.
It's probably a theory, but Goodhart is very confident.
That's what it seems like.
So Goodhart's law, when a measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. Target being when you are trying to accomplish something, right? You want more players playing your game. All right? So more players, player numbers go up. That's your target, right? What Goodhart's law is basically saying is that then becomes a poor way of measuring, because in your pursuit of getting more players, more often than not, you have unintended consequences.
All right, before we start talking about how data can ruin everything, if you like our videos, like and subscribe. We have a Discord if you want to hang out there. Also, this video is brought to you by
my Kickstarter. It's only got a few days left by the time this video comes out. So if you're interested in any of the beautiful playmats that you are seeing on screen, please check it out.
All right, back to the video. With Goodhart's law, the easiest way to kind of explain or give an example, the cobra effect. You have too many cobras.
Too many cobras.
There's too many cobras, way too many snakes. What do? Well, you put a bounty on the cobras. You say,
start blasting.
I will give you 100. You start
blasting
you
those
start
cobras.
blasting the cobras.
Yeah.
You put a bounty on their head. You say, bring me a cobra. I'll pay you $100 for every cobra you bring me. And the unintended consequence is that, well, people start gaming the system. We know a lot of min-maxers. There's probably a few that watch the channel. So min-maxers will breed cobras, kill them, and then turn them in for the reward. So you end up with more cobras than what you started with.
So the problem wasn't necessarily trying to get rid of cobras, right? But maybe it's getting more to the kernel of the problem, which is maybe you have too many cobra-related deaths.
Yeah.
Right? But even then, if you start then measuring cobra-related deaths, I used the example earlier when we were talking about it, like maybe you have to develop anti-venom, right? Something like that. But then maybe that anti-venom then ends up, yes, alleviating cobra-related deaths, but maybe there are side effects to the anti-venom that then causes all sorts of other consequences to people's health. Right. And so it's like, great, you knocked down one thing, but in doing so, created a whole other new problem.
Yeah, yeah. The way that this ends up usually popping up in game design is you'll see a lot of measurements of performance metrics. So usually a game that's already come out and you're sort of looking back at what has been and saying, well, what did players like about that? Let's try to parse the data and figure out if we can solve what the special sauce was then and recreate it.
Right. We had 75% player engagement for this one thing. So
well, and a lot of what you see too, especially now with sort of these microtransaction focused game design monetization systems, is a focus on like player uptime, right? Like we're focused on how long a player is engaged in the game, and we want that number to basically be as high as possible.
Right.
There's actually probably even more specific than that, where they're looking at like the amount of time someone spends equals dollars. So like, all right, well, we don't necessarily want people to spend just as much time as possible. We want them to spend exactly the right amount of time in which they are likely to buy something.
Right.
So maybe that's 2 hours, maybe that's 5 hours.
I think it changes depending on what game you're working on.
Sure.
But yeah, I think I've heard anywhere from an hour to 2 hours is like on average.
Right. So we're like, okay, well, that's the uptime we want to optimize for, and we want people to get off and come back because they're more likely to spend if that's the pattern of behavior we're seeing.
Right.
But really, the biggest issue here is that you're not measuring whether or not the game's good.
Right. Someone could sit and spend 2 hours and they are just grinding in some action RPG or whatever. Those 2 hours could be terrible, right? And you hear this a lot in a lot of games that end up having some sort of like a long form thing or some sort of end game content associated with them that like players are like, oh, well, I'm just kind of getting through this to get to the part of the game that I actually enjoy. But because you have to do that thing based off of data, excuse me, designers could look at that data and be like, oh, players are really enjoying this. They're all doing this thing.
Yep.
As opposed to maybe getting understanding that like players aren't necessarily doing that because they enjoy it, but maybe it's the most optimal way of doing that.
Right. And I do think that there's kind of some like sort of crossing like crisscrossed communication that happens too, right? Where you get these incentives from people who aren't necessarily designing the game, and they're like, hey, these are the metrics that we're using to measure success. Okay, designers and engineers, make something that fulfills that goal, right?
Yeah.
And so being, min-maxers, probably, if you're a game designer, it seems pretty likely that those are not necessarily, that Venn diagram isn't necessarily a circle, but it's probably pretty close.
It's pretty close.
You're probably going to try to come up with a system that fulfills that goal, right? And if the pressures put upon you, we talk about this a lot, like the pressures put upon a design shapes the design, you're going to end up creating some kind of a system that might not be the most fun, but will fulfill the goal of player uptime.
Right.
So an example in myself, working on Bullets and Teeth and Aliens, we were having a problem with game length. The game were going on too long. They were, creeping up on an hour and a half when we want them to be like 45 minutes. After running a lot of tests, I can identify, okay, well, which cards end up taking up the most amount of time, looking at bosses. And bosses stick around, and you're not drawing any more missions. Like you draw through the missions, you get to the end of the mission deck, you're at the end of the game, you fight the final boss, the game's over.
Right.
So that's sort of an immediate roadblock to you getting to the final boss, is that, okay, was the boss in the missions deck? You stop at that boss, you have to fight that boss until you can get further in the game. So one of the ideas was, well, what if you just kept drawing missions after you find a boss? You don't have to kill the boss, you can keep going forward.
Yeah.
What ended up happening, though, is that those bosses were part of the action, like the resource economy of the game. If you didn't have to beat that boss, you then get to keep those resources and have way too many resources when you get to the final boss. And so it created a foo strategy, first order optimal, which is that you don't kill any of the bosses. You just stun them so they don't kill you, and then keep going through the deck till you get to the final boss, kill the final boss, game's over.
Right. But what I think we ended up sort of realizing, like another designer could have looked at that, and based off of the Goodhart's law, they could be looking at the measurement, right, as the target, and they could look at the game and go, oh, great, I got it down to 30 minutes. Like, that's fantastic.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I wanted. That must work. But in our testing, yeah, it was a much faster game. It was right within the target, but then we sort of noticed not only could you potentially like rig the game in your favor, but it also just made for a less compelling experience.
Right.
And because I think we even also tested something where like it's not the bosses stuck around, but it was that like also the bosses maybe leave or something like that, or something like gets rid of the bosses. I don't remember. But basically like it ended up softening whatever the intended experience was meant to be, undercutting what the exciting moments were supposed to be in the game.
Well, it really undercut the final boss, right? Where you're supposed to get to this final boss, and it's supposed to be the final challenge, and it's supposed to be really close, and whether or not you can beat this boss or not. And if you happened upon this strategy, the final boss was trivial.
Right.
Because it really messes with the action economy of like how many cards you're supposed to have that can damage the boss. And those are supposed to be like being used up, right? You want to use them to their most efficient while you're playing the game, but the bosses leading up to the final boss are supposed to knock those, down, not knock your resources down,
right,
before you get there. So, what's the point? The point is that solution doesn't work. Well, I think the point is that this is that's really a second or like tertiary line of thinking in terms of like how the game is being affected by this decision. But those are the decisions that you have, like you have to be able to step through that process and really be able to see like, oh, what is my action economy doing here? And by making this decision, in the system of the entirety of the game, where does this decision affect the other downstream? Like where are the downstream effects from that decision?
Right. And that tends to be what the problem ends up being a lot of the time when we end up looking at these sort of measurable data-driven decisions in design, is that like, yeah, you did solve this one problem, but in doing so, you didn't see the unintended consequences that are like way further away, right? It's literally creating a sort of butterfly effect within your own system that you might not even necessarily be able to see until you see enough play testing happening with it. So what's this got to do with magic?
Oh,
We're a magic channel.
Oh boy.
We talk about magic.
Do we?
We got to talk about magic still.
Well,
the algorithm needs us to talk about magic, Gavin. If we don't talk about magic, people won't watch us.
It's probably true.
It's very true.
Commander, in the video.
Thanks for coming. No, we actually have a pretty decent example, though. I think that this sort of decision can relate to, like all of the things, Commander Magic.
Yeah, let's before we step in it real quick here.
Because we're going to step
in it. That's what we do. I will say that the business incentives here are tough because ultimately a business's incentive is to make money. Like that's capitalism. So it's very difficult for a designer to spot a downstream effect that is like really likely or kind of likely but not certain. Yeah. And be able to argue that, hey, we shouldn't do this thing that makes us a bunch of money because we might have a problem later. And
that problem didn't really even arise for like 8 to 9 years.
Right. So was it even really a problem?
Right.
Right. Now maybe the problem is popping up, right? We're seeing sort of the erosion of other formats in favor of Commander. Mark Rosewater has even mentioned just recently that Commander has officially overtaken every other format as the most popular way to play Magic, which I think we all knew.
Everyone knew. Yeah. It is nice that they were pretty official about that, though.
Yeah.
Announcing, officially Commander is #1 and Modern is #2 for the formats.
So, they print Commander decks in 2011, and 13 years later, it has now eclipsed every other format.
Right. But it didn't, it started in a harmless manner, right? It started in a nice, you guys like this, you guys have played this format now for, I think it started in 1999, maybe 98, something like that. Whenever,
unofficially, sort of the beginnings of the format, sure.
And so it's been around for a long time up to the point that they finally decided to start officially supporting it. And I think overall people generally liked it when they started supporting it because it was just in small little doses. But the idea that this would then become the most popular way of playing the game as a casual format, it pretty much takes over Kitchen Table Magic, which was the previous way of playing the game in a more casual way. And it now has become a format that they have to officially support consistently with every new product line that they come out with. There's no way they could have seen that coming. That's just such a you'd have to see every single thing going in that direction. And not only that, but to even predict that 1v1 games in general would be starting to lessen.
The greater trend of that we're moving away from sort of 1v1 competitive to free for all competitive.
When that was still in 2011, still the height of Magic and its impact in tournaments.
You're probably thinking, oh, this is a cool casual format. Let's support it a little bit, see what happens. What's the worst that could happen?
What's the worst that could happen? And technically, the worst that could happen, they make a fuck ton of money.
And they did.
Yeah.
So, and honestly, even right now, it's pretty hard for us to even argue now that Magic is worse because of it, right?
Yeah.
We as game designers and system designers of our own games and understanding Magic on a deeper level are seeing some of the cracks, but they might not matter, right? There's a possibility here that Magic just becomes Commander, and that's just what the game is from now on, and everything's fine. I'm skeptical, but it's possible.
I think what is a dangerous line of thinking to go down, which I see a lot of players go down, is the game's bad because of X, Y, and Z. That means the game is bad because it is doing these things. Yeah. And even in we've on this channel, we've talked a ton about the problems of free-for-all multiplayer games. We've criticized Commander and talked about that. We'll have a video coming out soon, I'm sure, where we're going to talk about what we think could maybe alleviate some of these problems with Commander. It's sort of like saying, okay, is the game Munchkin a bad game, right? Sure. Or is it a game? Every game is someone's favorite game. Right. And obviously there's a lot of people that love Commander. So in what some people might view as this being a bad thing or this being a problem, it's that's something that is just part of the game system that you have to account for. It doesn't necessarily mean that the game is bad or that the game is broken or anything like that. It just means that that is something that you have to be accounting for when you are designing things to be around that game.
This was the caveat, right? The caveat was that it's really difficult as a designer to advocate for decisions that might have bad downstream effects when money is involved, right? It's really difficult for you to say, hey, we can't do this thing that's going to make us $1 billion because it might destroy the game.
Right.
how are you supposed to win that argument? There's no way to do it.
And also, like, how are you supposed to? Is it worth the side effects? Right. This is something that Richard Garfield did in the very beginning of the game. Right, when he developed the Power 9. Is that a problem that is just worth having? Is Commander being the main format that people are playing a problem worth having for Magic? And they now have more money and resources than ever before to try and fix or alleviate that problem. So maybe it is worth having in the end.
Yeah, I mean, only time will tell. I mean, the other part of this here is like if the rest of Magic, like if Magic just becomes Commander, right? There's nothing else besides Commander. Are these even problems anymore, right? Because part of the issue with what we're seeing is this sort of butting heads of these two ways of playing Magic and how different they are.
Yeah.
And so if Commander is just Magic, a lot of those issues go away. Commander has its own issues.
Right.
I think what's tough is to see, you know, from a sort of systems design, game design standpoint, it's tough to see a game whose systems have so many flaws overtake a game that is nearly perfect. That to me is like, that's the tragedy of the situation, I guess, right? Like, and maybe I'm biased, sure, right?
I think you might be a little biased.
I mean, it's...
How long did you play 1v1 Magic for?
20 years? Trying to say I'm biased?
No, I can't see any reason why you'd be biased. No reason I could think of.
Look, Magic 1v1 has stood the test of time, clearly. Till the only thing that so far that took down Magic was Magic.
Right. Which way to go, Magic?
Way to go, Magic. You did it.
It's not often that happens.
You did it.
Yeah.
You did it.
You'd think it would be some other trading card game, but nope.
Yep.
Basically, data's not bad. You need data, right? Like, it's going to help you in a lot of cases. You need to be able to collect larger amounts of information. You want playtesters. You need playtesters to be giving you a lot of information to be going off of so that you can make meaningful decisions to help better shape your game into the game that you want it to be. Just don't be blinded by your pursuit for specific measurements.
I think the problem really is in the pursuit of money and using data as a justification for taking particular actions that just make you more money, right? In that world where you have, you know, creative professionals who know how to design things well are now up against this leverage of data where there's nothing to stand on, right? There's nothing for you to bring to the table because it's almost a fallacy. You're saying, hey, I can see these inevitable downstream effects. I can't prove them. I'm not 100. I cannot 100% say that this is going to be a problem down the road. But what you can 100% say, or at least you can use the data to say, 100% we will make more money if we do this.
Right.
And that, I think, is the problem. It's not necessarily the data that's the problem. It is the justification for actions to make more money.